Before I begin, I just need to say that the events that I'm going to tell you about were not planned as a stand on an issue. They were not intended to be a protest. It wasn't the kind of challenge to white supremacy that John Lewis talks about. John Lewis, you know who I'm talking about, right? John Lewis, the founder, one of the founders of SNCC. He talked about making good trouble and getting in the way of white supremacy. That's not what this was. It was a party. It was a party for my friends. That's all it was. And it was the community that turned it into a stand on an issue, the white community. Just want to make that clear. Now, every year since 1967, when I became a freshman at Wake Forest High School, I'm 69, by the way, in June I will be 70, so big landmark anyway. But every year I had thrown a party for my friends, and every year it was no big deal because all of my friends were white. Now, the only thing that was different about this party in 1969 was that some of the friends who were invited were Black. The schools in Wake County, and I know you've studied this in school, but the schools in Wake County, like schools all across the South, drugged their feet when it came to desegregation. In 1954, as you know, Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that separate but equal was unconstitutional. But it wasn't until the mid-60s that Wake County developed a policy called freedom of choice, which meant, theoretically, that any student, regardless of racial identification, could attend any school that they chose. Now, I say theoretically because the brave kids who integrated Wake Forest High School in 1967 and 68 found themselves isolated and persecuted, called names. They were blocked on their way to class in the hallway. One student told me that she had spitballs thrown at the back of her neck while she was in math class, and the teacher said to her, well, just try to ignore it. The white teacher, obviously. She said to me, it was the loneliest time of my life, and her mother begged her every morning not to go. Because she was afraid of what might happen to her daughter. Now, full integration was planned for 1970-71, and so 1969, the year that I'm here to talk about, was the year before full integration, or if you talk to white people, they said forced integration. It's always interesting to notice the words that people choose to use, right? In 1969, the year before that was to happen, about 9 Black juniors were encouraged to come from Du Bois over to Wake Forest High School so that they would have time to acclimate themselves before they had to go through senior year. So 1969 was also my junior year at Wake Forest High School, so many of the Black students who came over from Du Bois became my friends, and one of them is here today, and that's William Lucas, who is now not only my friend, but my husband since the end of January. So at almost 70, I'm a newlywed. I don't know, go figure. All right, so now just a little bit of background. When I was born, my father was a farmer in Princess Anne County, Virginia, an area that's now part of Virginia Beach. When I was 4, my dad felt a strong call to the ministry and was ordained as a Baptist preacher. Now, that was the same year that a dynamic young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen to be the president of the newly formed SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I mention that because the coincidence is striking to me, because Martin Luther King went on to have a tremendous and profound effect on my father. After the shooting, the News and Observer, I believe you've read some of these articles, so I'm just going to address some of the inaccuracies as I go along. After the shooting, the News and Observer quoted my father as saying that his views were, quote, simply that black is as good as white. I believe that. I've always believed that, and no one's going to change my mind, end quote. That statement is inaccurate. The truth is that my parents grew up in the Jim Crow South. They were not the white people who displayed Confederate flags or burned crosses in people's yards, but they did believe that every person needed to know their place, which is code speak, meaning that they supported segregation. Now, there were little things that they did in the name of fairness that undermined white supremacy. For example, when my granddaddy was voting registrar for the Princess Anne County Courthouse, he refused to give a poll test to black people who came to register to vote. He had a 4th grade education, and when he looked at that test, he thought, I could never pass this test, and yet I'm allowed to vote. So he went back to his bosses and he said, I either give this test to everybody or I give it to nobody. And they promptly fired him. And my father worked in the fields with a man named Cleveland who was black. When they ended up close to the house at lunchtime, my parents invited Cleveland into the house to eat lunch with them at the same table. Now, at that time, black people and white people did not sit down at the same table to eat together, you know. And if you did that, that simple act could get you killed or worse. So my parents and my grandparents believed in a certain level of what they considered fairness, but they did not challenge the systems that white supremacy had put into place. My granddaddy did not go down to the courthouse and say, this is wrong, you know. He just got fired and that was the end of it. However, as time went on and my father went through college, he found it increasingly impossible to ignore the nonviolent resistance movement, and in particular, the preaching of Martin Luther King Jr. Dad told me that he kept searching the Bible to find something to discredit King. But not only did the Bible not discredit him, the Bible supported the gospel of love that King was preaching. Finally, in 1967 or so, my father was already in the seminary here in Wake Forest. He said to himself, Wes, the reason Martin Luther King upsets you so much is that he's just a better Christian than you are. And either you sit down and listen to what he has to say or get out of the ministry right now. So he decided to stay and listen. He still thought, like many white moderates and liberals, that these things take time. You know, we don't want to move too fast. But when King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, he said, if a man like that can be murdered for preaching a gospel of love, we're not moving too fast. We're moving too slow. About 9 months after King's assassination in January 1969, the all-white Ridgecrest Baptist Church called my dad to be their pastor. Now, the church is still there. It's about 6 miles west of Wake Forest along Highway 98 in an area known as the Hurricane. You know what I'm talking about, Hurricane, when I say Hurricane? Yeah? Okay. Anyway, back then, Wake County was a dry county. And so the Hurricane's big claim to fame was that it was the place where you could buy moonshine, you know, little mason jars full of corn liquor and white lightning. It was also an area known for being a hotbed of racist attitudes and bigotry. My father knew that when he took the pastorate. For example, people were named after Confederate generals like Stonewall Jackson and Nathan Bedford Forrest. And at least one white church in the area, founded 20 years after the Civil War, had a clause in their constitution that if an N-word came onto church property, they would be promptly removed. Now, removed is another interesting word, because it can also mean eliminated, you know. Dad was up front with the white search committee from Ridgecrest about his support for integration. And he informed them that by that time he had friends who were black and would not hesitate to invite his black friends into his home for dinner. As the search committee left the house, my mother turned and said, "Well, you can kiss that church goodbye." To their surprise, the phone rang about an hour later, and he was offered the position of pastor. So they knew. They knew. They can't claim they didn't. Under my father's leadership, the church, which had been struggling, began to grow in both attendance and offerings. They had previously shelved some plans for a parsonage. I almost said orphanage. That's a Freudian slip. Because they didn't have the money to build it. But after Dad had been there a few months, they decided to pull those plans off the shelf and to build the parsonage on Stony Hill Road that summer of 1969. And we moved out into the Hurricane in September of 1969. That year, I was the editor-in-chief of the Devil's Spotlight. I have my show and tell. The Devil's Spotlight, which was the Wake Forest High School newspaper. A black sophomore, Warren Massenberg, had joined the staff. Many of you know Warren. Wrote an article highlighting an instance of discrimination that he had uncovered, and we published it. So Warren and I were promptly called into the white principal's office and told that in the future, all articles would have to come to the principal's desk for approval. So Warren got together with a white friend, John Steele, and they printed an alternative newspaper called The Voice. And in it, this is actually the one from January of 1970, after the shooting. In it, they published the original article that Warren had written, along with an article about the meeting with the principal and another article protesting the Vietnam War. They distributed the paper on campus and were both suspended for a week. Meanwhile, I began planning my annual party. I was so excited because we were going to be in the new parsonage. We had a fireplace in the family room. It was going to be so cool, right? I was 16. I put together a list of friends to invite, and one day my mom sat me down in the kitchen. She said, "You know, some people are going to be upset that you are inviting your black friends as well as your white friends. Are you sure you want to invite them?" I was indignant. I fired back at her, "Mom, if I can't have a party with all my friends, I don't want to have a party at all." She said, "Your father and I knew that's what you would say. And we support you. We just want it to be your decision," which I think was genius as far as parenting is concerned. At every step of the way, we were included in the decisions that were made. So when the newspapers would ask my father, "How does your family feel about this?" He said, "What do you mean?" "Well, I mean, you taking this stand." He said, "I didn't take this stand alone. My family took it with me." So, Anyway, she suggested that I create a list of everyone I had invited to show to my friends, particularly my white friends. And this goes back to the point that we were not trying to make a stand on an issue. We weren't trying to trick people into coming to an integrated party. We didn't want anyone there who didn't choose to be there. So at first, most of my white friends were very excited about the party, like they always were. But then, coincidentally, after they saw the list with the names of black friends on it, one by one, they came up with excuses for why they couldn't come. Now, some of my black friends also decided not to come, but for different reasons, obviously. One black friend's father said an integrated party in the Hurricane, and that was the end of that. The Wednesday before the party, the deacons at Ridgecrest called a special meeting to try to convince my father to cancel it. My father refused. He said, "I have been teaching my children to judge people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. How can I now tell them that their friends are not welcome in our own home because they're black?" He emphasized that he was not trying to integrate the church, that he was not insisting that they plan integrated parties in their own homes. The deacons, however, were more concerned about the angry rumblings in the white community in the Hurricane, about the church's loss of influence and respect among their white neighbors, about possible damage to their brand new parsonage. The discussion went round and round for 2, 3, 4 hours, and finally they said that if my father allowed the party to go on as planned, they would ask for his resignation. Dad said, well, I have to do what I have to do, and y'all are going to have to do what you have to do. And that's how the meeting ended. It was complete stalemate. The Saturday of the party, my white friend Margie Bola and I went to a Beta Club convention. When I got back to the parsonage, my dad was outside doing target practice with a shotgun his father had given him when he was 14. He told me that he was trying to make sure it still fired, but in retrospect, I expect he didn't mind people in the Hurricane knowing that the Baptist preacher knew how to handle a shotgun. When I went inside the house, I saw that Mom was rearranging the furniture in the living room, which was the main room on the front of the house. She was moving the couch end tables over to the picture window in the front of the house and closing the curtains. And I asked her what she was doing. She said, oh, I'm just moving the lamps over to the window. Pardon me. So that if anyone walks through the living room, their shadow won't fall on the curtain. I was confused. I thought, what? You know, in case there's any trouble. That got my attention. You think there's going to be trouble? No, she said, but just in case. Now, one of the newspapers reported that 2 of the dozen or so young people were Black, but the truth is, in the end, only 6 of my friends came to my party on Saturday, December 13th, 1969. 2 white friends, Margie Bowl and John Steele, and 4 Black friends, Marjorie Gill, whose married name is Smith, Silas Jones, Mike Justice, and William Lucas. My 14-year-old brother John had invited friends too, but none of them came to the party. On the night of the party, there was a turkey shoot going on up the road from the parsonage at the Stony Hill Fire Department. My dad and I drove past it on our way into town to pick up 1 or 2 of my friends. William and Silas Jones came with Mike Justice in Mike's car. The party started at 8. We were in the family room, which was on the back of the house directly behind the living room, which faced the road. There was a fire in the fireplace, a Christmas tree in the corner, records playing on the stereo, for those of you who remember both records and stereos. Thing of the past. After about an hour, we all began to relax. My grandparents were visiting, and they were keeping my 9-year-old brother, Brian, entertained in my parents' bedroom watching TV. At around 9 p.m., Bryant padded through the family room and told Mom he wanted some popcorn. Popcorn sounded like a good idea to me and my friends, too. So we began to crowd toward the kitchen, which was on one end of the family room. Moving away from the middle of the family room, this is important to know. Now, John Steele got his popcorn first and couldn't get back through the door, so he walked from the kitchen into the dining room, through the living room, through into the front hallway, and back into the family room, and was standing in the other end of the family room. He crossed that room 10 seconds before the blast. Yeah. Dad was fiddling with the stereo, so he and Steele were both at one end of the family room. The rest of us were at the other end, bunched around the door to the kitchen. I was talking with Margie and William, when behind me I heard a loud boom. I spun around to see the wall of the family room splintering open, and I thought, oh no, Mom is going to be so mad. I thought someone had brought a firecracker into the house. and thrown it behind the couch as a joke. Then Dad yelled, "Hit the floor, cut the lights." We just stood there, stunned. So he yelled again, "Hit the floor!" We dropped down, all but Mike, Silas, and William. Finally, Mike and Silas got down, but William was still standing in the middle of the room, 6'2". I reached up, grabbed his hand, and pulled him down to the floor. He told me recently actually, that it was only once he was on the floor that he realized what was happening. Now, my dad knew exactly what had happened. He ran to the bedroom, got his shotgun, loaded it, and ran back across the family room to go out the side door onto the carport. Steely, who was a pacifist, was at his elbow. Dad said, "John, I know you're a pacifist, but if I see the son of a, I'm going to shoot him." Steely said, "Yeah, I don't say that word in respect for the church." Okay, but my dad sure said it. Who said that Baptist preachers don't cuss? Anyway, Mom called the police, and she said she'd never forget the voice on the other end of the phone drawled, "We knew y'all was going to have some trouble out there this evening." It took the deputy sheriff, who, by the way, was the father of one of my white classmates who did not come to the party. It took him 45 minutes to drive 6 miles. When he walked in, he casually strolled into the house, surveyed the damage for about 2 minutes, and said, "Well, you know, it's kind of hard to catch them unless you catch them red-handed." He did very little examination then or ever after. He agreed to provide an escort for my parents to take my friends back into town, but he drove way ahead of them. Highway 98 was a curvy, hilly country road back then. And Mom told me that most of the time they couldn't even see his taillights. If anyone had been lying in wait, they could have easily ambushed my parents and my friends. I don't remember driving into town with them, but they told me that I did. But a lot of this I forgot until they told the story to me. When we returned to the house, we pulled the mattresses off of the beds in the front bedrooms and put them down on the floor of the family room so that we would be behind 2 walls and low down on the floor, just in case anyone decided to circle back and try again, firebomb the front rooms. Meanwhile, my dad set up rewriting his sermon. He sat in a folding chair and stared at the floor. And I remember him just muttering. He was kind of rocking back and forth, and he muttered over and over, "I never thought they would try to kill children. I thought they'd come for me." The next morning, Sunday, we went to church as usual. My mother taught a Sunday school class. How in God's name, I don't know. And my brothers and I went to our classes. My dad went into his study to prepare for worship. The deacons followed him in and closed the door. "We want you to resign," they said. "I'm not going to resign," he answered. "If you want to get rid of me, you'll have to go on record." "Well, we don't want you to preach." "Well," Dad said, "you have a problem because your Constitution says that you can't call a special business meeting until after the worship service, which means that until then, I am still your pastor. And as long as I'm pastor, that is my pulpit, and I will preach." When church began, in walked my white friends Margie and Steely, and with Steely was Warren Massenberg, who was probably the first Black person ever to enter those doors. I find it so ironic that by opposing the party in our home, the deacons brought the first, and maybe the last, Black person ever into Ridgecrest Baptist Church. There's an irony there. I love it. The church was packed with white people from the Hurricane, over 100 when the usual attendance was like 50 or 60, who were outsiders. They were curious to see what would happen. My dad began his sermon. He talked about how when we use words of violence, we contribute to violence, how violent talk can trigger what he called a person of little ego, someone who probably felt like he might be able to be a hero if he did what he thought the community wanted done. At that point, he broke away from the sermon he had scribbled on index cards the night before, and he began to sing, in a voice cracking with emotion, a song that we had all learned in Sunday school. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. He leaned over the pulpit and said, when we taught that song to our children, did we mean it? At the meeting after the service, the vote was 27-11 to fire my father, with 20 abstentions. Some of the people who abstained from voting later explained to him that they did so because they were afraid that if he won the vote, Dad would stay and they would find a way to kill him. The deacons warned us to get out of the parsonage as soon as possible, which we were only too happy to do, to get out of that hellhole. But we had no place to go. During Sunday dinner, the phone rang. My geometry teacher, Mr. Ford, and his wife, Liz, offered one half of their large house over there on North Main Street to be our home for as long as we needed. My father warned them that by helping us, they might be endangering their own lives. They responded, "It's our fight, too." The first night at the Ford's house, I have to include this story. My brothers and I woke up to hear Christmas carolers on the lawn, a group of seminary students and professors. When they began to sing, "We Shall Overcome," the three of us tumbled out of bed and downstairs to join our parents on the front porch. And it's like something out of a movie, but I kid you not, it really happened. A light snow began to fall. Dad urged Mom to take us three kids to Virginia to live with her mother. She said, "Where are you going to be?" "I'll be here finishing up." "Oh, no." "Oh, no," Mom said. "I'm not going anywhere without you. If you're staying, I'm staying." When they asked me, I reportedly said, "My friends can't leave, so I'm not leaving." Like mother, like daughter. The sheriff's department lost the report of the shooting for 2 days, claiming that it had been filed in the wrong box. Now, there were different stories about that. Deputy Munn had been attacked, and so he wasn't in the office, so he hadn't actually filed a report. Yeah, right. So the newspapers didn't catch up with us anyway until Monday or Tuesday. We were moving the last of our things out of the parsonage, and that's when these photographs were taken of my father and me by the shattered living room window. 17. How many of you are familiar with firearms? Okay. 17 double-aught buckshot, which is the biggest buckshot you can buy, fired from a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun, okay? We're not talking light, little warning shots. Came through 2 layers of glass and sprayed across the center of the living room wall in a pattern about 3 to 4 feet wide, and the center of it was about chest high. And it would have hit you in the head anywhere from 6 feet to 3 feet. 7 of those, somebody said to the newspaper, "Well, you can tell they weren't trying to kill anybody. They shot high enough to miss them if they were sitting down." To which my mother said, "How many teenagers do you know who sit down at a party, right?" Yeah, right. 7 of those pellets came through the wall into the family room with enough force to strike the fireplace across the room, and 1 pellet embedded itself in the stone. A munitions expert told the newspaper that the buckshot used could kill a bear or a large male deer at 150 feet. The shot was fired 75 feet from the only lighted window on the front of the house. They were not shooting to warn. They were shooting to kill. Now, the aftermath. At school, almost all my white friends avoided me. My brothers and I were told never to go anywhere alone and always to be aware of our surroundings. The police questioned William and Mike Justice, two of my black friends, without an adult present, which, because they were both under 18, was illegal, people. William told me that the police tried to pressure them to say that my father was not in the room, to make the case that he had fired the shot himself. But because he yelled, everyone had looked at him, and they knew he was in the room. William told my father, Mr. Shipp, I think they're trying to pin it on you. The Wake Weekly published the Ford's address on the front page and the information that we were living there. My mother said, why don't they tell them which side of the house we're living in, so they knew which side to aim for? My mom had a wicked sense of humor. At the night of the party, and the SBI later asked her about this, she said, well, at least we didn't get blood on their precious parsonage. She's about 5 feet tall, but you didn't mess with my mother. Anyway, calls came at all hours of the day and night asking for the white N-word. My mom was home alone during the day. There were no voicemail or voice machines back then. So she had to answer the phone in case it was one of us or Dad, and invariably the voice on the other end threatened that she would never see her husband or her children alive again. We received virulent hate mail, sometimes in the form of cheery Christmas cards, which were signed KKK, and the words, "We are watching you," underscored in red ink. A white man came one night to warn us that the Klan had our pictures posted everywhere and that we were on a Klan hit list. Later, my father said, was that a warning or a threat? And Ridgecrest owed my father back pay and 60 days severance pay. He never received a penny of that money, and never received a letter from the church either about their reasons for firing him, which technically they were supposed to do, to go on record. On the other hand, okay, here's the good part. From the black churches and black community in North Carolina, we received tremendous support. Black churches asked my father to speak. Only black churches, no white churches. They passed the offering plate after and gave us never less than $100 at a time when my grandmother's white church paid him $25 to come and preach. Today, the equivalent of that $100 would be, I looked it up just to find out, $750 in spending value. At every black church where my father was asked to speak, we were invited to sit down and share a meal with the church members afterwards. Now remember, black people and white people did not sit down together at the table. So staying for the meal was a stronger witness, particularly since it was our whole family, than any words my father spoke from the pulpit. I realize that now. 3 black men, Reverend Dunstan, Mr. Alston, and Mr. Baldwin, went door to door in Franklin County, where 3 of the 4 white officials were rumored to be Klan members, and took up money for us. My mother kept all the envelopes. They delivered it in person to the Ford's house in a shaving kit. And they did this 3 or 4 times, anywhere from $50 to $100 in nickels, dimes, quarters, and dollar bills. Reverend Dunstan said, I'm tired of seeing good men run out of the state. When we went to a black church in Smithfield, we had to drive past a sign. Many of you probably know that sign, saying, welcome to Smithfield, this is Klan country, and it had a picture of a Klansman on the back of a rearing horse holding a burning cross up in the air. I'll never forget that. It's burned into my brain. That sign was not removed until 1977, by the way. At one of the black churches, members patrolled the grounds with shotguns during the worship service. because there had been threats. My father registered for a handgun, and it lay on the seat between him and my mother everywhere we went. I find it curious that there were many newspapers that did not carry the original story about the shooting, but they did carry the article about the gun, labeling my father a pistol-packing preacher and questioning his Christianity. My father's response was, "I'm a Christian. I never claimed to be a pacifist." You know, oh God, there's so many stories I could tell you, and I could go on forever, but anyway, I'm going to go on. I'm so grateful. I am so, so grateful to my parents for not making me and my brothers go to Virginia. They could have, we were kids. We went to every Black church as a family, and not only did I get to experience a style of worship in the Black churches that was much more engaged, shall we say, than what I had grown up with, but when as a young musician I heard Black gospel music, the real deal, for the first time live, it changed my whole approach to music. There was one song in particular that the Black churches sang over and over, "Beams of Heaven." The chorus went, "I do not know how long 'twill be, or what the future holds for me, but this I know, if Jesus leads me, I shall get home someday." It was a song so meaningful to my mother that even with dementia in 2014, she could recite all the words. And she turned to me and told me, "I want that sung at my funeral." And it was. We received letters of support from people all over the country, many of them white, far more than the letters of hate, sometimes with $1, $5 bills enclosed. One from New York City, Brooklyn, said, "Wishing you a speedy exit out of hell." But there were also letters, surprisingly, from small country towns in North Carolina, written by white people who identified themselves as such in the letter, who said they never would have had the courage to stand up like we did, but that they agreed with us and supported what we were doing. And please accept this small token of their appreciation. And at a time when my father thought he might graduate from a Baptist seminary only to be unable to find a Baptist church that would hire him, a church in Louisville, Kentucky read about us in the paper and called him to be their pastor. They were a previously all-white church that had voted to stay in a community where more and more Black people were moving in. They wanted to build an interracial fellowship, what King called the beloved community. And reading about Dad, they thought, they thought he might be the one God was calling to lead them, and he pastored there for 6 years. He went on to pastor an American Baptist church in New Jersey, which became not only an interracial fellowship, but an international fellowship. And the final thing I want to say is that 52 years after we last saw each other, William Lucas and I met again to talk about this story. And we ended up getting married on January 29th of this year. So, there's a lot of beauty that comes out of story. As my father said to the Louisville paper when he went there, he said, "It's good to be able to say that, you're not necessarily buried if you take a stand that's unpopular." So that's what I have to share, and I thank you for listening and for being so attentive. It's a lot of stuff to go through, and there's more, but another time maybe. Thank you.